Hello and welcome to the 13th episode of the Pepper Podcast. For those who are returning, welcome back. And if you are new, the Pepper Podcast covers a wide range of spicy events that occur in our daily lives. Two high school students tackle heated topics through discussion. I am your host, Jay Mehta, and joining me is my co-host, Andy Watson-Uskenpen. And today's topic will be centered around gun violence and the heavy toll surrounding them. There are around 19,384 gun-related homicides in 2020, according to data from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which is the CDC. Nearly 53 people are killed each day by a firearm in the United States, according to the data.
Yeah, so killings involving a gun accounted for nearly 79% of all homicides in 2020, according to the CDC. That's a larger proportion of homicides than in Canada, Australia, England, and Wales, and many other countries. Which, if we just take a look at the news, it seems like every time we go on a news site or look at the watch TV or something, it kind of, like we always see something about mass shootings, either school shooting or mass shooting at a church, or like most recently what I saw um was a mass shooting on a New York train car
Mm-hmm.
where the guy
Yeah,
like opened a gas canister or something and then shot everybody, and he's still like I believe as of recently he's still like
at large.
wanted.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's really insane that like it's such a normalized like situation for Americans especially, because I believe that there have been this year alone, like 2022, there have been 136 mass shootings, and that's an incredible amount that like even I like, I was like, oh, that's normal. That's definitely not normal, because that's hundreds and thousands of people getting injured and even killed
Yeah.
by gun violence alone in the country.
And that's such an exorbitant number. And again, like you said, like I remember in 2020 where I would just hear constantly about you know, like mass shooting on mass shooting and shooting and shooting and shooting, especially with
Yeah.
school shootings, which we'll go
Yeah.
into later. But according to the BBC, like you said, killings involved a gun accounted for nearly 75%, 79% of all homicides in 2020, and there
Yeah.
were 19,384 gun-related homicides in 2020. That's a large number. So
Yeah.
53 people being killed each day by a firearm, that's very high, in my opinion. But
Yeah.
like since 1970, there's been 1924 incidents involving the discharge of a firearm on school property, and 637 people have died. So
Yeah.
school shootings are also something that, and like you said, I guess touching upon a point that you said previously about, it's not really that much of like a shock factor. I mean, it
Yeah.
is, but it's been normalized to a point where when you hear about it, all you
It's
really
kind of
feel is like sadness.
desensitizing
Yeah, it is
Americans.
desensitizing.
Yeah,
Where
yeah.
now really the idea is like it does if you don't if maybe the event doesn't necessarily happen to you or doesn't happen in close proximity to you, it's not maybe as important to you because the amount of emotion you feel, um, or this is what it's called, like emotional tolerance,
Yeah.
um, is the in scope. The farther you move away from a source, um, the less I guess emotionally attached you are. And
Yeah.
so, especially with these school shootings that are far away, it's very difficult for people in the other part of the state to really understand and be sympathetic and empathetic for what's going on,
I
right?
agree. Yeah.
So especially with school shootings, so like there's a record number in 2020. And there was just this year, there have been 22 school shootings.
22. Yeah. Yeah.
That's it's such a large number
That's
considering
insane.
there have been 114 school shootings since 2018. So
Yeah.
that's a little bit less than like a fifth. And it's around a sixth, but that's still a lot of school shootings.
Yeah.
Um, and there's just really no way to combat it other than kind of not necessarily
We
limiting the
need we
amount
need
of
some sort of
like
gun
you
reform or
yeah.
legislation or something that to reduce this gun crime, because it's an alarming problem right now.
Yeah.
And like you said, 22 school shootings this year. I had like I haven't even I don't even remember seeing one on the news because in the mainstream media and how like they know so many like school shootings happen that like it's not necessarily unique, which should be a wake up call to Americans.
Yeah. And I guess something that I want to like put out there about like gun reform is that like out of the main bunch of people that are like gun owners, most of them are properly trained, right? They
Yeah.
know how to operate a firearm and they like they're very respectful with it. Um and I feel like especially with gun control and things like that, I
Yeah.
feel like there's like a lot of people that are just like the bad apples that kind of spoil the whole
Mhm.
bunch almost. And that's something that has been forced upon these people, which can radicalize some.
I
And
agree.
so that's been very polarizing in that aspect, where we're not able to reach a medium, where there's where we can
Yeah.
understand that we can differentiate what is like a normal gun owning person that is properly trained and knows how to operate a firearm versus somebody
Yeah.
that just got their parents' firearm and they want to go out and do harm to
Right,
people, right? There's a
right,
major
right.
difference between that. And so I guess when it comes to gun reform, I think something that's very important is properly training people, to own guns,
Yeah. I
without
agree.
proper gun control and like, sorry, not gun control, but gun reform and like proper education, especially with how like to deal with a firearm. That's very difficult, to especially if you're in a situation where you need to enact. That'd be very
Mhm.
difficult, for people that are untrained or not properly trained to act
I
upon it.
agree. And it's like, you know, if we're talking about gun training, I completely agree. Everybody who gets a gun and receives a gun or like goes out of their way to buy a gun, right, and exercise that right that they have, do need to kind of get that training because it's essential because like not just for the person, right, but for other people's
Yeah,
safety.
yeah,
Because if you operate a gun and don't know how to do any like safety maneuvering, you could hurt yourself and even worse other people. And I think that's just an imperative move that we need to move towards is like mandatory gun trading and licensing because like the fact that like 80% of mass shootings we were using guns that were registered and were legally like acquired. And so it's well yeah, it's not really like it's just a nuance. It's like you need to be able to be trained in that way so that you and others can be safer. It's just like kind of like a barrier to prevent like a preventative measure.
yeah, yeah. And something that also deals with like gun training and things like that is that some like states don't have um a permit for like gun carrying. Like you can have permitless
Yeah.
gun carrying, and that's
Yeah.
I think it's around 22 states that have that. But like the idea behind it is that without a permit to carry your weapon, you're less likely to be trained and less likely to be educated on your firearm. I'm not
Yeah.
saying this is I'm making generalizations, of course.
Yeah.
Case by case is like you have to take things on a case by case basis and everybody's different. But based off of the generalization, you're less educated generally, which does induce, more violence in those areas.
Yeah. Yeah.
And studies have
No,
also
I
shown
agree.
that like there's a lot of there's a correlation between like gun violence and low poverty areas, which is something that I guess does have to tie with education around the topic.
Yeah, I agree. And it's a really multifaceted issue as we've come to learn in the past years because it's something that isn't really talked about because it's such a sensitive topic. Because Americans, it's a right, right? It's hard to change a constitutional right and people just aren't really comfortable with that
Hmm.
change or attempting to change because like yes I agree with you, it's like the bad apple situation or it's really hard to have a situation where it's like one bad apple can ruin it. Yeah, sometimes it's easy to ignore that bad apple or to like punish them, but one bad apple, if we're talking about guns and gun violence, is incredibly disastrous for
Yeah.
hundreds of thousands of families and individuals who get affected by that one or a couple bad apples, right? And it's a problem because all over the news again, as I said, like gun mass shootings and school shootings, etc. They happen so much,
Yeah.
like so much, a lot that more than people actually are aware of, and it's just like if we're talking about like a gun reform, like for example, in 1994 they banned automatic like assault weapons. So like Bill Clinton signed something that kind of banned assault weapons in the U.S. September 13, 1994. However, it has seen discernible effect on gun violence. It didn't really have much a discernible effect. So like nothing like yes, there was a decrease in assault weapons, but the amount of gun like related crimes and like mass shootings, etc., did
Mhm.
not necessarily see a significant decrease at all.
Yeah, and going off some of your like of some points of what you said about how there are tons of families and people that are experiencing gun violence, especially with schools. According to an article here, more than 292,000 students have experienced gun violence at schools since Columbine. So that's a very significant number considering 292,000 students is very is it's a very large population that has experienced something so unfortunate as seeing a school shooting.
Yeah.
But going also back to what I'm talking about low poverty rates and gun violence, from
Mhm.
a study, youth in poor areas are more likely to die from gun violence.
Yeah.
And it shows that around, a study published by JAMA Pediatrics found 62% of the more than 67,000 firearm related deaths that occurred among youth between the ages of 5 and 24 from 2007 to 2016 occurred in counties where the percentage of residents who lived below the federal poverty level was 15% or greater. And so the
Yeah.
annual rate of total firearm related deaths among youth increased from 8.5 for every 100,000 residents in 2007 to 9.2 deaths per 100,000 in 2016. So we are on the rise for gun violence, especially in low poverty areas. Or sorry, in
Yeah.
high poverty areas.
In high poverty,
Yeah.
yes. I think that's a great point that you bring up because it's also something that a lot of people overlook. Is that there is a higher prevalence of reliance in guns in lower socioeconomic areas because they rely on that protection to keep their family safe and their loved ones safe. And I think that's something people overlook when they just claim like outlawing every gun in the US because like they overlook like especially the marred history of gun ban like banning guns. Like I know Ronald Reagan, he targeted the Black Panthers, like the black group that was like that took up arms to fight for equal rights and like fought against discrimination.
Yeah.
He actually implemented some of the first like gun laws to disenfranchise them and to like harm them and to pretty much give them no power. And I think a lot of that sentiment still carries over in not necessarily like direct ways, but more like unlike unforeseen consequences where like if you do ban everything, you're ignoring the fact that in lower socioeconomic areas the people there rely on guns, and it's just a product of their poverty because they need to rely on those guns to be able to feel safe and to keep their family safe. And it's just something that like I just I never thought about until I did some research a few years ago, and it really opened my mind when I took into that consideration that perspective.
Yeah. And like US violent like but just going off like about how like it's about something of protecting yourself.
Yeah.
Since the 1990s, crime rates have plunged, regardless of data sources, which is good. The less crime is, the better. But still, Americans tend to believe crime is up nationally, less so locally, which is very interesting.
Yeah.
Um, because and that has to deal with media. Media can definitely take data sources and kind of skew it to the way that they want, and
Mhm.
it's been common, especially nowadays, that more like media has like have been like kind of exploiting data sources in order
Yeah.
to fit the narrative of what they're trying to say and fit the theme of what they're trying to say, and
Yeah.
so kind of like the more they be like more specific and more manipulative of their data, like the guess
Yeah.
the narrower and narrower the viewpoint is. And so
Yeah.
that's been a very common theme throughout the years, which is unfortunate, which has contributed to this high thought of crime is up nationally, less so locally.
Yeah. I agree. And it's a really difficult topic because it's hard to educate people who are unwilling, to be educated or like find out things for themselves. And so many of those kinds of people, it's really difficult just to hold a conversation or like to have a fruitful conversation and dialogue. And this especially comes to like gun violence. As you said before, like there have been so many, mass shootings this year. It's just very difficult to come to a common consensus. And the data is also very skewed, as you said, because you can look at one source that says the studies from this, think tank or this organization show that having more guns is actually better, because the argument that like um if the guy with the gun or the girl with the gun, whatever, has the gun and is committing a crime, more people have guns to defend against other to like attack them back. So you'd see like a decrease in crime, and some studies show that. But also other studies say the opposite, and they debunk that, saying it's a very like uh, very skewed experiment or data set that they present,
Hmm.
and it's very hard to find concrete evidence,
Yeah, yeah.
because like one of the solutions or steps that I saw when I was doing my research for today's episode was making the Center for Disease Control, or the CDC, consider mass shootings a public health issue, so that it does more research and data gathering, so we can interpret what's actually going on, what works and what doesn't, on a more like empirical scale. So there's not as much, analogous data showing, oh, this is saying, oh, this is going to decrease gun violence, whereas this other thing is going to increase it, or vice versa, and they contradict each other, but they both claim themselves to be right. It For people who do want to actually educate themselves on the issue or form their opinion based on evidence like that, it's very difficult for them, especially like me, because I see it and I don't know what to think, because I'm considering multiple perspectives, but they're contradicting each other, saying that they're both right, and it's very difficult. And I think that making the CDC accountable for considering mass shootings a public health issue and looking into that is a very responsible and good step towards decreasing gun violence in general.
I wholly agree with your statement. I'm very glad that you brought that up about conflicting viewpoints. Like I said
Yeah.
previously, the same piece of data set can be interpreted like completely, different, by two
Yeah.
different sides. And that's what really is kind of mind-boggling, because for somebody that wants to research more about a topic, it's very difficult for them to understand what's truly happening when both sides that are conflicting, present themselves.
Right.
And so a good way, like you said, is to hold these unbiased research organizations accountable for doing their own research to truly figure out what's going on. But it's still very difficult for an average person to get that information, specifically because these mainstream media outlets are using the information to their own for their own beneficial, their own gain, which is very detrimental for just the people involved, because they just believe what the media says because it's the media. And this goes for every side. There are very few now, especially nowadays, especially with the polarization, um I guess towards like post 2018, 2019, post COVID, or like during COVID,
Yeah.
where it's become so polarized, where it's become an issue that things are conflicting, even with the same amount of data. Like
Yeah.
I saw, like, especially researching for this, I saw that, oh, permitless like gun carry and crime rates, they're very directly correlated, and it goes off a certain data set. And then I look at another part and it says permitless gun carry and crime rates are decreasing, and they're
Yeah.
completely conflicting, and I don't really know what to think. And
Yeah.
so I have to collect more data and more evidence to support, maybe to really truly understand what's going on behind these things, which is
Right.
very difficult. And this goes for really any topic, but especially with more politically confusing subjects or very convoluted subjects, or that are more maybe polarized. It's very
Yeah.
difficult to get a more middleman perspective, if you will, for lack of a better word, for just a general
Yeah.
unbiased viewpoint that conveys the nuance to the argument in both sides. But going back to, about how crime is so, it just happens so often. Like, fewer than half of crimes in the U.S. are reported, and fewer than half of reported crimes are solved.
Yeah.
And so that's 25% of crimes total are solved versus, while half is reported. And so that's something that's really sad to hear. Because can you imagine having four cases and only solving one? Like, what happens to
Right.
the families of the other three cases, where they, experience, gun violence and robberies and things like that, where, auto thefts are the most likely to be reported and murders are the most likely to be solved, which is good. But still, there's, an increased rate, and thinking of that there's more crime nationally, where crime rates have really dropped, and so that's led to this thinking where if everybody's doing it, then it's kind of like, let's join the norm. And this is very
Yeah.
concentrated in these, high poverty areas, not low poverty areas, high poverty areas, that typically, consists of more minority organization, or,
Yeah.
minority people, which creates, and here's our word for the day again, perpetual cycle, um,
Right.
of of gun violence, where it's leading to an ideology, that the only way to solve conflict is through violence, and it's gone to the point where, through crime rates, like crime rates and adjusted rates of firearm related homicides are very different by race. Um,
Yeah.
where deaths
Right.
per 100,000 of a population is extremely high in Black non-Hispanic people compared to, other races, and especially in male predominant sectors.
Yes.
While
Yes.
what's also very interesting is American Indian, or Native
Mm.
American, is around 10 deaths per 100,000 population, with an SEM for around 3 people, which is something that's very, interesting, but it makes sense
Yeah.
considering they've also been very, you know, this also has to do with, just discrimination overall,
Yeah.
and how discrimination has led to a bottleneck effect and has led to more internal conflict than, just positive influence.
I agree. And I'm glad you mentioned, the demographics because if we I think the importance that we need more data and research into this topic is because if we look in like as you were saying, the people who are most likely to shoot and be shot are black men in urban areas because those are the people most commonly found in lower socioeconomic areas because there's like the uh, de jure segregation, et cetera, like that cycle of poverty that African Americans have been stuck in
Mhm.
over the course of hundreds of years. It kind of there's a strong correlation between poverty and gun violence. And if we look at Hawaii, like gun ownership rates have increased, but gun violence remains very, very low.
Yeah.
But also, if we look at the demographic of Hawaii, right, there's always the native Hawaiians, but then you see this increase of white Americans or affluent, more wealthy white Americans coming and living there, which is a totally separate problem that we may address in another episode. Disenfranchisement of the native peoples, resources being depleted, etc. Like
Mhm.
they're already well off. They don't necessarily see a lot of gun violence anyway, so that's kind of skewed data there. So we can explain that because of that.
Mhm.
But there are so many solutions like there are so many solutions that have been put forward, but like we said, like a lot of it has been hidden behind a cloud of misconstrued data, and I'm going to talk about some of them.
Mhm.
So, if we talk about, like one of the arguments that I hear a lot when I'm, conversing with somebody about the topic of gun violence and gun control, quote unquote, is like background checks,
Mhm.
right? Like background checks for requiring background checks for all gun sales and kind of like also like requiring um 10 round max magazines for like assault weapons. So like it's you're constricting the magazine size as well as having background checks put in place. However, it's really like the data shows that, you know, with more background checks, people with like drug counts and kind of suspicious activity will be pretty much denied. And so gun violence has been shown to decrease. However, researchers have stated that, according to the New York Times, uh, this is only because that there are less guns on the market, less guns in circulation, which is why gun violence has reduced. Which you can see both ways. Like, are you stopping a potential shooter, or are you just decreasing the amount of guns? And this is again where the information comes to, like a point, and
Convoluted.
it just, you know. Additionally, mental health screenings. I know, Jay, you've been to Youth in Government, and
Hmm.
I went like 2 weeks ago, and one of the proposed bills was to require mental health screenings for all peoples who had a gun and were trying to acquire a gun. However, according to Jeffrey Swanson, while like may seem like a good idea, according to Jeffrey Swanson, who's a psychologist and sociologist at Duke, he found that mental illness is not a good indicator of gun violence at all, whereas drug and alcohol abuse are far better predictors. And most mass murderers don't have a history of mental illness, so while yes, it is a good idea, like a good step, like a good intention, it won't necessarily see a significant decrease in the gun violence which we're trying to solve, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And that also leads to our final solution, which is, and I don't think this would work, but it would be just banning guns altogether. And we see other countries, the UK, Australia, Japan, they have super stringent gun laws, outlawing guns altogether. They've seen significant decreases in gun violence, which it's expected because there are no guns. While yes, criminals will have them, criminals aren't necessarily the people who commit mass murders. Like, they are, but not to the extent that mostly normal, like normal everyday people, quote unquote, like commit mass murders. So yes, criminals, while there will be gun crimes still, it will be drastically reduced. Mass shootings will see a drastic reduction. But as previously stated, we generally overlook the socioeconomic importance that guns have in those communities that rely on them so much.
Yeah.
And it's
Absolutely.
also, just one more thing, the cultural, constitutional, and political hurdles that implementing a federal gun ban will have on Americans. There will be riots in the street. There will be protests everywhere because Americans believe, it's their Second Amendment, their right to bear arms. And Congress has stated numerous times over and over again that they will stand to protect the rights that Americans have to like have individual guns. So I personally don't foresee America banning guns anytime in the future soon because of so many barriers that come in between that.
Yeah. And I think it's something in like going back to how young black men are, the major victim of this situation, where young black men and teens made up more than a third of firearm homicide victims.
Yeah.
And like you said about background checks, 14 states require background checks um,
Yeah.
on firearms. So it's definitely a smaller set of population compared to the,
Yeah.
the I guess national aspect of things. And so introducing more, number one, education through kind of your firearm training and things like that,
Right.
um, combined with maybe background checks and mental health checks, that would better, and also soberness, that would better induce a lower amount of, you know, like related, or I guess firearm related deaths, which is something
Yeah.
that's very important in our society.
Right. I agree. And just to recap, right, like the data for this specific topic is so misleading if we look into both sides because there's always political bias that comes into it, and there's always, you know distraction, like something wrong with an experiment that other people call out that people believe, people don't believe, and it's really hard to come to a common consensus and make have your own concrete opinion on the topic. That it requires a lot of work, and I do definitely think that if there was more research into mass shootings and correlations and more empirical evidence that laid a clear foundation, that um, we can definitely work towards reducing gun violence in a more efficient way. And with that, our discussion comes to an end. We thank you for listening and hope you'll stay tuned for future episodes. Don't forget to follow the Pepper Podcast on Instagram, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Thank you.
Thank you.